Chapter 12. The Great Enterprise. It was determined in the first place to act on New Year's Day, tomorrow. This really went without saying. New Year's morning, with the jailer on duty, also Mameluke, too bilious to be efficient, offered the Meister one and only chance of entering the corridor above the dungeons. Or may we not assume it a certainty? Proposed Miss Bianca. Seconded, said Bernard. For such a momentous discussion, they're having an extra special meeting of the Prisoners' Aid Society Black Castle branch. They just cleared lunch away first. Call it a certainty, said Nils. Carried unanimously, said Miss Bianca from the chair. We all three then, she proceeded, entered the corridor. Question, said Bernard. I suggest Madam Chairwoman join us below at the water gate, thus bypassing at least some of the peril. I certainly won't, cried Miss Bianca. To venture alone down to a river, she added, more formally, without other members to assist and guide, is something no chairwoman should be asked even to contemplate. We all enter the corridor together. Nils then makes contact with a prisoner. Trust me for that, shouted Nils. I'm sure we do, said Miss Bianca. Nils next, through the grid, throws down the right key. She paused. How do we get the right key? Asked Miss Bianca. The jailer will have it on his belt, said Nils, along with all the rest. Bernard and I have seen him. I throw down the whole bunch, and the prisoner will sort out which is his. But, how do we get the keys from the jailer? Persisted Miss Bianca. By force, said Nils. Miss Bianca had an uneasy feeling that the point wasn't really settled. How exactly did one use force on a jailer if one happened to be a mouse? But she didn't want to undermine the meeting's confidence. Also, she recalled the saying of the great Duke of Wellington's to the effect that whereas his enemies made plans of wire, he made his of string. That is, he always left something to the inspiration of the moment. Frail and pliable as string, yet in the end strong as a rope ladder, Miss Bianca trusted their plans might prove and pass on to the next step. Thank you, Nils, she said, for your excellent idea. You then jumped down yourself. Oh dear, added Miss Bianca, now losing a trifle of her own confidence. How do I get down? Nils and Bernard went into committee for a moment. I will jump second, reported Bernard when they came out, and between us we will stretch my handkerchief like firemen. Then you jump into it. It won't be half so dangerous as saving us from Mameluke. I suppose I can, murmured Miss Bianca, and returned to her role as Madam Chairwoman. Next, we induce the prisoner to place his confidence in us. Trust me for that too, shouted Nils, and conduct him, he having unlocked his cell with the key provided, to the riverbank. There have been far too many interruptions from the floor, added Madam Chairwoman Miss Bianca severely, and I don't want to hear anyone say, Ben will have to swim for it. The meeting knows it will have to swim for it. And then march for it, muttered Bernard. And then march for it, agreed Miss Bianca. She ought really to have called Bernard to order too, but somehow she didn't. It thus appears, she continued, that until the jailer goes his round tomorrow morning, there is nothing we can usefully do. Our best course is to get as much sleep as possible in order to recruit our strength, though I must say I should like to leave things tidy. In fact, after sleeping all the rest of the day while Mameluke watched fruitlessly outside, they spring-cleaned half the night. There was no real reason for it. Probably no mouse would ever take that hole again, yet Miss Bianca's instinct was right too. There is nothing like housework for calming the nerves. Mameluke went off to the party shortly before 12, so they could put all the furniture outside. Then for hours all was peaceful domestic activity. Faintly, as Nils and Bernard took the carpet up, they heard the songs and shouts of the jailer's midnight feast. Faintly, as Bernard and Nils cleaned the wallpaper with dry breadcrumbs, they heard a last burst of merriment die away. As dawn broke, Miss Bianca, sweeping out a last pan of rubbish through the lobby, saw Mameluke the Iron Thumb totter back and collapse before the hearth, by which time the nerves of all three mice were as calm as could be. It was pleasant, too, as after a sustaining breakfast, they took a last look round to see everything so neat and clean. It wasn't such a bad hole after all, admitted Nils, as he got into his seat boots and buckled on his cutlass. Cudgel in hand, Bernard nodded silently. He couldn't trust himself to speak. In spite of all the terrible circumstances, the hours he spent hanging wallpaper for Miss Bianca had been among the happiest of his life. He was glad to hear her give the whole a kind word, too. Adieu, dear Hole, murmured Miss Bianca softly. Dear Hole, adieu. Bernard picked up her valise. Nils looked out first to see if the coast was clear. It was. Beside the stove, Mameluke still snored and tossed in queasy dreams. For the last time, they picked away among the cigar butts and the matchboxes and the chewing gum wrappers. Miss Bianca cast a long, compassionate glance towards the poor butterflies on the walls, but they were none of them sorry to see the last of the head jailer's sitting room. 2. Along the corridor they hurried, down some stairs, along a corridor, and down more stairs again. It was all strange territory to Miss Bianca, but Nils and Bernard, after their explorations, ran on unhesitatingly. Not a soul besides themselves was about. Empty stretched the corridors, unguarded the stairs. All jailers save one, as Mameluke had foretold, lay still abed, quite unable to lift head from pillow. But where was that one? As the mice approached the corridor above the dungeons, they began to take more care. At the last flight of steps, Nils crept on in advance, while Bernard and Miss Bianca waited halfway down. I hope he won't be long, whispered Miss Bianca, for now that even their own footsteps were stilled, the silence was frightening. The whole weight of the castle seemed to press down on them like an enormous, million times magnified paw. Then back Nils called in triumph, then hurried after, and beheld inert against an iron door, holding it open like a doorstop, the jailer with the food pans. He had got just so far before collapsing. The pans and their contents lay scattered all about. To Miss Bianca's extreme relief, there was obviously no need to use force on him, for he was sound asleep. What a moment that should have been! What a half moment, indeed it was. But scarcely had the mice savored their triumph when they perceived something they hadn't bargained for. There was no bunch of keys at the fat jailer's belt. The key ring dangled far out of reach overhead, where he had left it in the lock of the smooth iron door. No mouse can run up smooth iron. Now what do we do? Muttered Nils desperately. Think, said Bernard. We can't be beaten now. Enormous above them, like a mountain, loomed the bulk of the big fat jailer. Like a mountain! Bernard had been mountaineering with Nils half the previous day, and the top of the jailer's head lolled only an inch below the lock. Stand ready to catch, cried Bernard recklessly. The Duke of Wellington would have been proud of him, as Bernard now acted on the inspiration of the moment. So was Miss Bianca proud of him, as Bernard, without the slightest hesitation, leaped up onto the jailer's outstretched foot and ran up his leg, and then across his big, heaving stomach. It heaved like an earthquake, and then up on his shoulder. "Oh, pray take care," called Miss Bianca, almost too far below to be heard. Bernard waved back and mountaineered on. Across the jailer's face was a traverse to dismay the most expert. Where beard stubble gave place to bare flesh, it was like traversing polished rock. Bernard only just managed it, and only just in time. The mountain turned volcano as the jailer sneezed, but Bernard, his foot at the roots of bushy hair, had plenty to hang on to. The jailer sneezed, but in his sleep. Courageous Bernard plunged ever on, now as through a greasy jungle. He attained the jailer's very scalp, and thence, with a supreme effort, launched himself at the dangling keys above. Twice and thrice he swung his full weight from them, then out they came from the lock, and he and key ring together cascaded jangling down. Over to you, Nils, gasped Bernard. Nils instantly ran on. There was no time now for praise or congratulations. Bernard and Miss Bianca followed, dragging the keys between them. Beyond the comatose jailer stretched the dungeon corridor itself, with, set in its floor, at intervals of 2 or 3 yards, the gratings over the dungeons. Nils ran swiftly from one to the next, calling through each a word of Norwegian. The suspense was almost unbearable, for suppose the jailer should really wake. An age seemed to pass before, at the very last, Nils halted. Had someone answered? Evidently, yes. The keys, cried Nils. Between them, they pushed the keys through the bars, easing them side by side on the ring, then eased the ring through too, and heard it fall below. Norway forever, cried Nils, and unhesitatingly launched himself after. So did Bernard. Miss Bianca, peering down, in a matter of seconds saw his handkerchiefs stretched to receive her. Fortunately, it was a very large handkerchief, more like a young tablecloth, but even so she had to shut her eyes before she could nerve herself to follow. Indeed, only a joint cry of, "Be brave, Miss Bianca," gave her the necessary impetus. But it did. She shut her eyes and jumped. A moment later, they were all three together in the Norwegian prisoner poet's dungeon. The first stage of the unachievable had been achieved. 3. But poor prisoner, poor poet. It was difficult at first to tell whether he was old or young. He looked so thin and ill and shaggy. The hair that streamed in outflocks over the rags of a prison uniform. Was it fair or white? Were those eyelids red with age or with weeping? Huddled on the edge of his bunk, he might have been 20 years old or 100. Only something in the way he huddled, elbows on knees, chin on fists, reminded Miss Bianca of the way the boy used to huddle if ever the boy was terribly, terribly unhappy. "Oh, he's young," she whispered. "Poor, poor prisoner." What spoke most eloquently of his despair was that the bunch of keys lay still where it fell, on the ground beside his bed. He hadn't even stretched out a hand to see what it was. Or perhaps things had been thrown down at him before, in jailerish sports, just as Mameluke sportively jumped down to spit at him. For a moment, the mice could only gaze in pity, while the eyes of Miss Bianca at least filled with tears. Then Nils again said something in Norwegian. "Be still, my poor brain," muttered the prisoner. "Is not one such delusion enough?" In fact, Nils had to repeat himself, shouting, about 4 times, before the prisoner looked wonderingly up. First up, then around. Nils was almost hoarse before the prisoner looked down. As soon as they had his attention, the 3 mice lined up, and Nils and Bernard took 2 steps back, then 1 forward, and politely pulled their whiskers. There was nothing like sticking to manners in any unusual situation. Miss Bianca, in the middle, bowed. After only the slightest pause to get his legs properly under him, the prisoner rose and bowed back. It must be remembered that he was a poet. It is the gift of all poets to find the commonplace astonishing and the astonishing quite natural. The sight of Bernard and Nils and Miss Bianca, Nils in his sea boots, Bernard carrying a valise, and Miss Bianca wearing a silver chain, therefore didn't disconcert him in the least, and when Nils again addressed him in Norwegian, he was far more delighted than surprised. Yet how feeble his own poor voice, after the long silence of solitary confinement, as he courteously bade them welcome. Miss Bianca again felt her eyes prick with tears. Tell him we are come to save him, she prompted. That's what I'm trying to, said Nils, rather impatiently. But here goes again. He launched into quite a long speech, interrupted from time to time by questions from the prisoner. He just wants to ask after his relations, translated Nils, more impatiently than ever. Tell him there'll be opportunities for that later, urged Bernard. Tell him that just now we've got to hurry. By this time, the prisoner, partly through weakness, partly to see his visitors better, had sunk down to his knees. Nils jumped onto his hand and ran up his arm and began to shout directly in his ear. I'm having to tell him all about the Prisoners' Aid Society, Nils called down irritably. Again, an age seemed to pass before the prisoner's expression turned from dreamy pleasure to as much as ordinary attention. But at last he began to understand, and his eyes grew brighter and brighter. He picked up the keys and cradled them lovingly in his palm, bending on Bernard such a look of admiration that modest Bernard blushed, and at last, with a few brief words, rose shakily to his feet. What does he say now? Asked Bernard. Will he come with us? He says, translated Nils soberly, that he puts his life in our hands. The three mice looked at each other. They looked at the prisoner's gaunt, feeble frame, and Nils and Bernard thought of the slippery steps down to the water gate and of the angry river beyond. What a responsibility! But their courage was high, and so, it seemed, was the prisoner's. He was a poet. He didn't think he was dreaming, as a prisoner who wasn't a poet might have done, and so missed his chance of escape. Shakily but resolutely, his fingers trembling but his spirit firm, he tried one key after the other in the lock of his door. At the third, it opened. There is no more wonderful moment in life than when a prison door opens. It was not through weakness that the prisoner for a moment again sank to his knees. Then up he rose, only one shuddered, as the cold, damp air whistled through his rags, followed the mice along the passage, and with a smile set his foot on the topmost of the Watergate steps. 4. The river had lapped back, yet even as they descended, the roar of water sounded louder and louder in their ears. The river was angry still, but there was no help for it. They had to go on. Each step seemed a separate precipice, slippery with washed-out mud. The mice skidded and slipped. The prisoner had to brace himself for support against the wet, rough, rocky wall. In fear and trembling, yet all resolute, they descended. In fear and trembling, they reached the bottom. And there, wonder of wonders, beheld a raft hugging the bank for shelter, tied to the old iron ring in the old newly revealed Watergate wall. The luck of the mice, cried Bernard. The luck of the mice at last. Nils, tell the prisoner to get on board. You, Miss Bianca, run along the rope, and Nils and I will follow. Nils said something in Norwegian. The prisoner nodded. He was at the very last step, only a yard separated him from the raft. Then that foot slipped, in he fell, a powerful undertow sucked him down, and the faithless river carried him away.